if your estradiol is moderately elevated, let's say 75 picograms per milliliter or above, 100, 125, I've seen up to 1250 picograms per milliliter. That's a lot of gynecomastia potential. Welcome to Vigorous Estrogenic Side Effects from Hell. Well, actually, we're just going to talk about estradiol and estrogens in general, because there's so many misconceptions that I see now in the comment section or through DM or by email that I think it's time just to dedicate one video to estradiol and all the things you need to keep into consideration when you start to take performance-enhancing drugs, because estrogen is not your enemy, just like a lot of people might think or say that it is. Estrogen is definitely not your enemy, and you have to keep it in its favorable ranges, otherwise you get a ton of side effects. Now, we have to understand that high estrogen and low estrogen both come with their unique side effects, but you can't only go by these side effects, because estrogen might not be the real contributing factor to the side effects that you're experiencing. So, say it with me, what do we have to do before we make adjustments? That's right, blood work. Blood work first, guys, please. Blood work first. We can't solely go by the side effects. So let's go over some of the common side effects of high estrogen first. Then we'll do low estrogen, and then we'll talk about the favorable ranges. So if you came here from the thumbnail, consider yourself clickbaited, catfished, misled. But hey, stick around. You might learn something, and you might be able to prevent your own side effects going forward. Even though you might think it's from estradiol, those side effects might come from somewhere else completely, entirely, altogether. Now, the most common side effect with estradiol that everybody seems to worry about is water retention. Water retention can come from so many different places, guys. It's not the first thing you need to think about when you have water retention. It's not only from estradiol. It could be from the hamburger you ate yesterday. Yesterday I had 2 hamburgers. And that's the only part of my body I'm going to shake. But you can see the water retention is apparent. But on my last blood work, my serum estradiol was around 32, 35 picograms per milliliter, which is nice at the sweet spot, a little bit at the top of the reference range, but not over the reference range. So the water retention that I'm experiencing right now, that's from dietary choices I made yesterday. Now, if you have water retention throughout the week, maybe look at some of the compounds that you're taking. Dianabol, nandrolone, too high testosterone, boldenone. There's so many compounds that could potentially hold water. So keep that in mind. Besides your estradiol levels, some of the compounds that you're taking, MK677, growth hormone secretagogues, insulin, they all potentiate a little bit of water retention. So just because you start to hold water, it doesn't mean your estrogen is high. Now, the second common side effect is, of course, acne. A lot of people associate acne with estrogen and estrogen alone, which is also not the case. Acne is mostly caused by hormonal imbalance. So every time you make an adjustment to your PED protocol, and let's say testosterone stays the same and anti-estrogenic compounds stay the same. So let's say you're taking testosterone primo, testosterone boldenone, testosterone masterone to keep your estradiol under control. Maybe you change your injection frequency, and now your hormones fluctuate. Or maybe you added in Winstrol or another oral Turinabol, for example, and now you're on more overall anabolics. Your hormones fluctuate. The amount of androgens that you have in your system are disproportionate to the amount of estrogen, progesterone, DHEA, pregnenolone, etc. that you have in your body. Your hormone panel, your hormone balance changes, resulting in acne. Now again, that hamburger or 2 hamburgers that you ate over the weekend might contribute to a little bit of acne as well. But of course, the most common effect, which is almost directly associated to serum estradiol concentrations, is gynecomastia. Not gynecomastia, gynecomastia. Again, so guys, sorry if I mispronounce here and there somewhere, but most of my studying was done on PubMed, and PubMed doesn't come with a pronunciation when you read those studies. So, gynecomastia is almost directly related to your serum estradiol concentrations, but there's 2 contributing hormones, progesterone and prolactin. Now, in normal breast formation in women, estrogen contributes to breast formation first, then during pregnancy, progesterone goes up, prolactin also rises, and as progesterone comes down after birth, prolactin stays elevated, which then promotes milk secretion. And then your baby can have a full and healthy life by feasting on those beautiful, beautiful milk that stays secreted for, months to maybe years on end, depending on how long your partner is able to breastfeed or is comfortable with breastfeeding, because apparently it's a very painful experience from what I've heard. So, estradiol contributes to gynecomastia formation in men, but progesterone and prolactin also contribute. So let's say your estradiol is somewhere at the top of the reference range, 40, 42 picograms per milliliter, depending on which reference range you follow. But your progesterone and prolactin on a range, you should be okay. Even if your estradiol is 75 picograms per milliliter and your progesterone and prolactin are in range, it's very unlikely for you to develop gynecomastia, unless you're on a secondary compound named growth hormone, which can actually activate the prolactin receptor. So you might get some prolactin-like effects from the growth hormone or the growth hormone secretagogues that you're taking. Now again, keep in mind that growth hormone or growth hormone secretagogues will hold a little bit of water. And water retention is not gynecomastia. And a little bit of puffy nipples, it's not yet gynecomastia. So there's several stages that gynecomastia undergoes before it's actually gynecomastia that needs to be taken care of with surgery. So you don't let so if you see, some issues, you see some formation going on, you see a little bit of puffy nipples or, an unnecessarily amount of water retention around your chest area, disproportionate to other parts of your body, you might have to start tamoxifen treatment or roloxifene treatment or tormifene treatment. Again, it highly depends on what you prefer. Now, keep in mind that tormifene, roloxifene, or tamoxifen cannot block the progesterone receptor. So again, if your estradiol is moderately elevated, let's say 75 picograms per milliliter or above, 100, 125, I've seen up to 1250 picograms per milliliter. That's a lot of gynecomastia potential. Again, I'll put that up on the screen if I can get my buddy's blood work results. I've seen that incredibly high. The guy was running everything under the sun between ment and nandrolone. And what else he was willing to admit. The PED stack was extensive, but he forgot to add aromatase inhibitor. So 1250 picograms per milliliter was the highest I've ever seen in the serum estradiol concentrations. So again, let's say your serum estradiol is moderate, 75 picograms per milliliter, maybe 100 picograms per milliliter. Your progesterone is actually below the reference range because, of course, your HPTA is completely shut down, even though you're taking ACG on cycle, but it seems to not give you favorable progesterone concentrations because the compounds that you're taking are so suppressive that you still don't get pregnenolone, DHEA, progesterone production in the adrenal glands or in the testicles, so your progesterone concentrations are still quite low. Your estrogen is at the top of the range, but not gynecomastia promoting yet, just quite yet. But your progestogenic 19 NORs that can activate the progesterone receptors more than enough by themselves, so whether that's the nandrolone, the trenbolone, the ment, the trestolone, they won't show up as progesterone on your blood work, even though, sometimes you see that the trenbolone shows up as progesterone on blood work when you do a conventional chemiluminescent microparticle immunoassay, which is not 100% accurate. So please keep that in mind. If you're running trenbolone and your progesterone is high, that's not progesterone, that's actually trenbolone. Either way, trenbolone is very potent by going through the progesterone receptor when serum estradiol is elevated out of the reference range in its formation in gynecomastia. Now, of course, 19 NORs activating the progesterone receptor in the pituitary gland also promote prolactin secretion. So now you got a triple whammy. Your estrogen is high. Your progesterone is low, but you get a lot of progestogenic-like activity because the 19 NORs that you're taking are activating and stimulating and trickling the progesterone receptor just as potently, and your prolactin is high. That's a recipe for gynecomastia. Now, when your estradiol is at the bottom of the reference range, it's very unlikely, but it can still occur. Then you just get gynecomastia through the progesterone and the prolactin pathway. So it's not unheard of that people that are keeping their estradiol suppressed, and maybe even in single digits because they're overdoing the aromatase inhibitor, and then suddenly they still develop gynecomastia. Maybe in the past they already developed a little bit gynecomastia when their estradiol was high, and now whatever gynecomastia that has already been formed is further developed by elevated progesterogenic activity or elevated prolactin levels. So again, gynecomastia is very complicated, guys. Estrogen is not the sole contributing factor, but if you're not on any of these 90 NORs and you start to develop gynecomastia, it could be that your estrogen is very, very high, or your estrogen is moderate and your prolactin is high, and prolactin can be elevated from many different things, including the 90 NORs, but also weed and kratom. Yeah, some of the recreational drugs are known to increase prolactin levels. And nowadays, when I see elevated prolactin, but in-range progesterone, and these clients are not taking any 90 NORs, my first question is, are you smoking any weed or are you taking any kratom recreationally? And if that's the case, you might want to discontinue that and the prolactin will come back into range. Okay, we got a little bit of off track here with the progesterone and the prolactin. Let's go back to the estradiol. So there's three main side effects of high estradiol levels, but again, the first two, the water retention and acne, estradiol might not be the sole contributing factor. And even when you develop gynecomastia, it could be that your progesterone-like compounds, so the progesterogenic 90 NORs, the nandrolone, the trenbolone, or the ment, are simply dosed too high. Or they're activating a little bit of gynecomastia, which was formed in the past and is still present because you didn't do any kinds of gynecomastia surgery. Now, keep in mind, you can't block the progesterone receptor when you're taking 19 NORs, but you can lower your serum estradiol concentrations and you can block the estradiol or the estrogen alpha and beta receptors with the tamoxifen, raloxifene, or tormorphine. And then in the meantime, while you're blocking these receptors, trying to halt gynecomastia formation, you can do your best to get your estrogen under control with perhaps an aromatase inhibitor, removing some of the compounds that convert into estradiol or promote estrogen conversion, mostly nandrolone. Even ment promotes a little bit of estrogen conversion, but the blood work that I've seen on ment is extremely limited because those guys usually don't come to me for coaching or blood work advice. So nandrolone for sure promotes estradiol conversion if you're taking nandrolone with testosterone, but ment, I'm not exactly sure. I've heard, horror stories of severely elevated estrogen levels, just like the example that I just gave you, where the guy was on test nandrolone and ment together, resulting in 1250 picograms per milliliter on the total estradiol concentration, which is legendary to say the least. And he was, his gyno was also legendary. So keep that in mind, guys. So while you're blocking the estrogen receptors, you take the progesterogenic compounds out, you get your prolactin under control, whether that's with vitamin B6, P5P, gabacholine, bromocriptine, pramipexole, whatever measure you have at your immediate disposal. That's probably the best way going forward because any of these methods are significantly cheaper than going in for gynecomastia surgery, which might set you back a couple $1,000s depending on where you live and the severity of the gynecomastia that was formed. Okay, so that pretty much covers the high estradiol levels. Another contributing one that we should go over is blood pressure. Now, I've seen guys with 100 picograms per milliliter have completely perfect blood pressure readings, even without adding in the nebivolol or telmisartan or the Cialis or any other form or ACE inhibitor or any other form of blood pressure management. So it's not a given that your blood pressure will go up when your serum estradiol concentrations are a little bit elevated, but it could be a contributing factor because estradiol contributes to the renin and vasopressin pathway, which can then cascade into angiotensin release. Now, of course, you can use an ACE inhibitor, an angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor to prevent the conversion of angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2 and keep your blood pressure in range that way. Angiotensin also promotes aldosterone release, which you can block with aldactone, spironolactone. But hey, why overcomplicate it when we can simply keep our estradiol favorable and prevent the renin, vasopressin, angiotensin, and aldosterone concentrations from skewing and raising our blood pressure. So again, I do believe that estrogen can contribute to high blood pressure, but considering there's so many factors that contribute to high blood pressure, it's probably not the sole contributing factor. And again, I've seen a lot of good blood work readings on, reasonably high, double out of the reference range estradiol concentrations. So again, when you do have high blood pressure, it might not be the estrogen at all, but it might just mean that you're getting a lot of angiotensin release through a different pathway. And in that case, you might need to consider a angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor or an angiotensin receptor blocker. Now, I would prefer an ARB over an ACE inhibitor, considering all the new data that is out there. So most people nowadays would go with a low-dose telmisartan over lisinopril. Even when estradiol is in range and your blood pressure is still high, that might be a viable option going forward because, of course, high blood pressure is the destroyer of kidneys. And from kidney failure, there's, unfortunately no coming back. So, you can't, if you have kidney failure, it doesn't mean you had high estradiol concentrations, considering that estradiol contributes to favorable collagen synthesis all over the body. But it's probably the high blood pressure that you were experiencing. So again, we're getting off track. That's the 4 situations for high estradiol: water retention, acne, blood pressure, and gynecomastia. Now, the opposite end, incredibly low estradiol. Now, the first one is Sexdrive. So high estradiol contributes to Sexdrive highly, given then DHEA, pregnenolone, progesterone, and testosterone, DHT, are also in a nice favorable balance. So you have your estradiol in a nice balance with all the other hormones, prevents acne, and keeps your libido nice and high. High enough for you and your partner. In some cases, it's only high enough for yourself, but then you need to work on your game a little bit more because libido is supposed to be shared. And I'll leave it at that. So low serum estradiol concentrations, your sex drive will take a beating. It will not be as optimal as it should be. Now, it could still be optimal because you're stimulating your sex drive through the 19-nors, like Trenbolone, for example, can keep your libido really nice and sky high, considering prolactin secretion is a little bit suppressed when your testosterone and your DHT is also, sufficient. Then Trenbolone is, more than enough to stimulate your libido through the progesterone receptor, even if estradiol is low. But in most cases, when estradiol is low, your libido will not be as good. And a lot of people experience that when they overdo the aromatase inhibitor or they overdo their DHT compound like a primobolan, masterone, or, dihydroboldenone, which might convert from boldenone itself, or you're taking dihydroboldenone directly, and your testosterone dose is not sufficient. In those cases, serum estradiol crashes as well, maybe into the single digits. But I found that anything below 20 picograms per milliliter is not really favorable for anabolism or libido. Now, again, like I mentioned in the progesterone video, you get a little bit of anabolism through the estrogen receptor pathway, just like you get anabolism through the progesterone receptor pathway. Now, most of the anabolism that we get is going through the androgen receptor pathway, or the growth hormone receptor pathway, or the insulin receptor pathway, or the IGF-1 receptor pathway. Or calories, calories in general. Those need to be converted from food into actual muscle tissue. But of course, you use the androgen receptor pathway and all the other pathways that are out there to get into the most anabolic state you can get. And dropping your estrogen into the single digits is not very favorable for your overall bodybuilding and your fitness aspiration. So keep that in mind. Collagen synthesis, the first thing you notice of low estradiol levels is that your collagen synthesis goes down and you get a very dry skin. Now, this reduces acne, obviously, so you get, less acne, or maybe no acne at all, but the low, or the dry skin and the low collagen synthesis, that's now lowered because your estradiol is not that favorable. And in most cases, most guys have, low progesterone levels as well, which also contributes to collagen synthesis. Low estrogen, low progesterone, no sex drive, terrible collagen synthesis, dry joints. Man, it doesn't sound good. Now, does it? Now, disregard the neuroprotection that you get from estradiol because it's very difficult to measure. Now, neuroprotection is something that should be in place, and you might see that, at the end of your life when cognitive decline usually starts to occur. But if you're, chronically in a single-digit estradiol concentrations, not only is your libido terrible, but you automatically start to notice cognitive decline. Now, you have to keep in mind that when you drop your estradiol for a purpose at the end of a cutting phase or a contest prep because you want the least amount of water retention. You can't do that too long because now you're losing on the fullness and the anabolism that you get through the estradiol receptor pathways, so the estrogen alpha and beta pathways. You know, you can do that for like 2 weeks, but if you do that for a prolonged period of time, you simply end up flat. You end up dry and flat, but you want to be full and dry, not flat and dry, right? Again, we're getting off track. I'm sorry, guys, but estrogen contributes to so many aspects of bodybuilding. It's we can sit here for hours, but I've already been here way over the attention span of the average YouTuber. Anyway, so let's sum it up. Low estrogen, collagen synthesis goes down, libido goes down, cognitive, health, sense of well-being, empathy, they all go down. Now, I can't really find a conclusive study or any sort of anecdotal evidence how bad low serum estradiol levels are when you're on, pretty oxidating compounds like trembolone, for example, which is shown to be neurotoxic at any dose. And testosterone is probably neurotoxic at higher dosages, especially when serum estradiol concentrations are very, very low, which could potentiate some neuroprotection when testosterone levels are high or other anabolic androgenic steroid levels are high. Again, there's a lot of study that needs to be performed. But what I'm honestly wondering, and again, there's no data to pull from, is how low or chronic low serum estradiol concentrations compare to recreational drugs, including alcohol. Because, of course, alcohol, the alcohol inside alcohol, has been shown to kill brain cells as well. So I'm wondering how much neurological decline an alcoholic would get over a recreational bodybuilder that drops your estrogen a little bit too low because they want to be shredded all the time. I would like to see a comparative study, but unfortunately the data is not there. Now, if you do both chronically low estradiol and alcoholism or frequent recreational drug use, now, let's be fair, not all recreational drugs have been shown to be neurotoxic, but I believe MDMA, some of the amphetamines, weed, no. Kratom, no. GHB, I think only in higher dosages. Alcohol, for sure. It's the most common recreational drugs that's being used. So there's a lot of data to pull from there. So there should be a comparative study at one point, but it's probably completely unethical to put people on these kinds of protocols. So I highly doubt it. But if you're going the fitness route and you're doing everything you can to stay healthy, you want to keep your estradiol at least in its favorable range. At the top of the reference range, I would consider favorable. So these are all the known side effects that come along with either high or low serum estradiol concentrations. And, there's many other side effects that are out there, but are not very, very common. And of course, osteoporosis, which is, very related to low estrogen levels because estrogen contributes to bone mineralization. Other contributing factors are there like high serum acidity levels, which leaches calcium from the bone, or poor phosphorus and magnesium intake, or poor vitamin D or vitamin K2 intake, which contributes to bone mineralization and the transport of calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus in and out of bones. Yeah, so again, it gets very, very complicated, and estrogen is not always the sole contributing factor. There's many other things that contribute to the side effects or the health ramifications that you might expect. High LDL, low HDL, another side effect of low estrogen concentrations. Low sex-hormone-binding globulin, another side effect of low serum estrogen concentration. So if anything, this video is here to convince you never to drop your serum estradiol below the middle of the reference range, which is, let's say, 20 to 25 picograms per milliliter on most blood work panels. If you see anything below 20 picograms per milliliter, you need to make adjustments to your protocol immediately, because you can prevent yourself a lot of hurt in the future. The first one being libido. If you have to measure all these known side effects of low estrogen concentrations, libido would probably be the highest on your list. Second one would be serum lipid concentrations, and then the sex-hormone-binding globulin. But of course, sex-hormone-binding globulin and libido, those pretty much goes hand in hand. So you fix one, you fix the other. Yeah. Too low sex-hormone-binding globulin is not good for your libido. Unlike all those anti-sex hormone-binding globulin guys that are out there that make it appear like SHBG is the worst thing known to man when it comes to libido. Actually, low estradiol is the worst thing when it comes to libido. And keeping your estradiol in its favorable range in most cases will raise your sex hormone-binding globulin to its favorable range for libido as well. And if that's not the case, it might simply mean that your hormone balance is still off and you need to look at your DHEA, pregnenolone, or progesterone concentrations. And you can bring that up with either ACG or DHEA and pregnenolone supplementation. I have a whole video dedicated to that, so just watch that if you're suffering from libido issues. Those anti-SHBG guys probably have stock in Bayer Proveronum. Actually, I have stock in Bayer. Guys, I'm not trying to manipulate the market here. Provarn might be suitable in the short term, but it's definitely not a sustainable compound, and your sex drive might go up for a little while, and then it will come slamming down as your sex hormone-binding globulin comes slamming down. Okay, so that's pretty much low and high estrogen. Let's go over its favorable range. Now, there's three cases. Let's say three cases. There's a cutting phase, a maintenance phase, and an off-season phase. Now, let's do off-season first, considering that estrogen is slightly anabolic, just like progesterone or acne steroids are slightly anabolic because they go through the estrogen receptor pathway, which potentiates a little bit of anabolism. Okay, so during the off-season, your anabolics are high, but your food intake is astronomical because food is tremendously anabolic. And without food, the amount of anabolics that you take are not going to be as anabolic when you're in a caloric deficit. That's why we have separate phases in bodybuilding, fitness, strength, etc. And there's always different phases. So let's do the off-season first. I feel that for most cases, up to 75 picograms per milliliter is acceptable. Beyond 75 picograms per milliliter, some guys might start to notice gynecomastia. But if you're using 19 NORs in your off-season, I would try to keep your estrogen below 50 picograms per milliliter because now these 19 NORs activate anabolism through the progesterone receptor, but high estradiol elevated progesterone-like compounds in your system, which could potentially also raise prolactin levels. Now you got that triple whammy. So you want to keep your estrogen somewhere slightly over the top of the reference range, but certainly not 100 picograms per milliliter. Again, 100 picograms per milliliter can be done without 19 NORs in your system, because you don't want to tickle that progesterone receptor in your nipples. And then the prolactin receptor as well, considering during the off-season you might be using growth hormone, and now you're tickling the estrogen receptor and the prolactin receptor already. Triple whammy, guys. Keep everything into consideration. So, two scenarios during the off-season with 19 NORs or without it. With 19 NORs, 50 picograms per milliliter at maximum. If you can tolerate high estrogen and you don't have so much tendency for gynecomastia, you keep your prolactin under control and you're not susceptible to prolactin-like activity from exogenous growth hormone or growth hormone secretagogues, up to 100 picograms per milliliter with most guys see favorable effects at 75 picograms per milliliter. Now, that pretty much covers the off-season. Let's go over to a maintenance phase. Now, with maintenance phase, it could be anything between hormone replacement, being very, very heavy, and you have a decent caloric intake, let's say 3,500, 4,000. Some guys maintain at 4,500, 5,000 calories per day. Those guys are the beasts. I would keep your estradiol somewhere in the middle of the reference range for bodybuilders, considering that, your testosterone is elevated. You're probably using other compounds as well. I would say between 35 to 55 picograms per milliliter is warranted. Now, I've mentioned several times before that I feel that the ideal range between testosterone and estradiol is 18 times higher or 13 to 18 times higher in your total testosterone than your estrogen on picograms per milliliter. And I calculated the range for, the nanomoles or the picomoles for total testosterone and estradiol. But honestly, guys, I can't remember the ideal range when it comes to picomoles per liter or nanomoles per liter on the total testosterone or the serum estradiol concentrations. So I'll put them down below in the description section, and then you can use that range if your blood work comes back at the picomoles or the nanomoles. So again, if it comes to the picograms or the nanograms, then the range total testosterone to serum estradiol is somewhere between 13 to 18 total tests to 1 on the estradiol. That works well for a cruise up until, get into the superphysiological dosage of testosterone, because again, going over 55 or 75 picograms per milliliter might be not conducive to the water retention, the blood pressure, or the gynecomastia. So there is a bit of a limiting factor here, considering what phase you're in. In a maintenance, I would let it come up to 55 picograms per milliliter, and during the off-season, maybe 75 or 100 picograms per milliliter. Now, during a cutting phase, it might be favorable to keep your estradiol somewhat suppressed. Now, in most cases, that goes automatically because testosterone is combined with several compounds which has anti-estrogenic effects, whether that's the primobolan, the masterone, maybe you're using a dihydroboldenone or winstrol or anavar, proviron. Again, some guys like to use that one. They all have some sort of anti-estrogenic effect, and you almost get a serum estradiol reduction automatically for free without the use of an aromatase inhibitor. Now, you don't have to crush your estrogen from the beginning of a contest prep or from the beginning of a contest phase. Ideally, keep it somewhere around 35 picograms per milliliter for the duration of your cutting phase. Then when you notice, unfavorable fat distribution around your glutes, around your hamstrings, around your quads, it might be time to lower your serum estradiol concentrations to 20 picograms per milliliter, which is sustainable during a cutting phase or contest prep, but your libido is not going to be that good. Well, considering that during the cutting phase, your caloric intake is also not that good, and you're so, your cardio's up and your food is down, and you're probably not going to get the best possible libido anyway. And you're stressed because you have a deadline and you have to be in shape at a certain point in time. Absolutely nasty peeled on, this day. So there's a little bit of stress involved. Your libido is not going to be that good anyway, and 20 picograms per milliliter is probably warranted. Then the last 2 weeks, you crush that bad boy all the way down to 0 with a whole bottle of Letrozole. Well, not that dramatic, but Letrozole, Letrozole, Arimidex at reasonably higher dosages, that's warranted. Again, for a photo shoot, you don't have to do that because the difference of water retention between crushing your estrogen and having it somewhere at 20 picograms per milliliter, you probably won't see that on a photo shoot with favorable lighting. But when you do step on stage, with lighting all around you that is trying to highlight your flaws, in those cases, crushing your estrogen to single digits is probably warranted, and you want to limit the duration of doing that to 2 weeks, 3 weeks at maximum. And when you're crushing it for 3 weeks at maximum, the amount of halotestin, superdrol, anadrol, and growth hormone loading and creatine loading and whatever kind of loading protocol you're doing is going to be incredibly complicated to compensate for this prolonged period that you have crushed estradiol concentrations. And you can do that with 2.5 milligrams of Letrozole or 2.5 milligrams of Arimidex. Now, people say that Letrozole is way more powerful than Arimidex. Well, look at the content of each tablet. Letrozole has 2.5 milligrams per tablet, and Arimidex has 1 milligram per tablet. Now, you won't get the same amount of estradiol reduction with 25 milligrams of Aromacin. Trust me, I've tried that, but most guys don't respond very, very well to Aromacin at the end, even though it's a suicide inhibitor. So on paper, it would make sense to use Aromacin over Letrozole or Arimidex to get all those aromatizing enzymes out of the system and metabolize them away while you're blocking them all the way through. But hey, a little bit of practical application show that 2.5 milligrams of Arimidex is more potent than 2.5 milligrams of Letrozole, which is certainly more potent than 25 milligrams of Aromacin. So when you go by the milligram for milligram, from the practical applications that I've seen in all the blood work, and the dramatic reduction in water retention at the end, I feel that on a milligram for milligram basis, Arimidex is more potent than Letrozole, and Letrozole is more potent than Aromacin. Okay. I think that pretty much covers it, guys, and I've gone way too long, so if you're still here, you're part of the Vigorous crew. Front double bicep for you, even though there's minimal estrogen and minimal testosterone in my system right now. I'm sorry for that, but at one point we'll get back on the Sawzul and wow you a little bit more than I just did. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you're looking for the most comprehensive guides to bodybuilding pharmacology and keeping your estrogen levels and progesterone levels and prolactin levels in range and favorable for the most amount of anabolism with the least amount of side effects, consider purchasing some of my ebooks. You can find them on my website, VigorousSteve.com/shop. If you're looking for personalized advice, you can find the rates to my services there as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. Follow me on Instagram @VigorousSteve. And I'll see you in the next video.